a good email question. This comes from Christine in New Hampshire, of course. And she asks this: Dear Father, my 10th grade son, who's homeschooled, brought his Mass and the Sacraments book by Father John Lau to me with this question. On page 30, it says, the sponsor in baptism should not again be discharged this office for the same person in confirmation unless confirmation immediately follows baptism. Most of our children were instructed to select their godparent as a sponsor unless they were not practicing their Catholic faith. Was that incorrect?
So the book, it's a great book, Mass and Sacraments by Father John Lau. It's written, I think, about 100 years ago, maybe a little bit less. And until the 1960s, the teaching was that there should be two different sponsors for baptism and confirmation. And the reason for that was because when we take a sponsor, we get somebody that is supposed to be watching out for us, praying for us, making sure that we are strong in our faith. You know, the baptism sponsors really agree that if the parents become unable or unwilling to raise the child in the faith, that they'll do what they can. And then at confirmation, then the sponsor, again, sort of takes on the duty of being there to encourage their candidate, their charge. And so that's kind of traditionally what the church encouraged. I don't think there was an actual change in doctrine or anything like that, but there was sort of a change in the emphasis, I think in the 70s and 80s, where it was more encouraged. They said it because I think this might be the reason they wanted to really emphasize these three sacraments of initiation, which are baptism, confirmation, and Holy Eucharist. So baptism is the entry into the church. Confirmation is the sealing of baptism, the completion of baptism, and then Holy Eucharist is the food for the journey. And that's true, and that actually has always been taught by the church. We see this in the Eastern rites, because in the Eastern rites, babies are baptized, given confirmation, and receive Holy Communion in some of the rites on the same day as infants. And they would call it chrismation as opposed to baptism. They say chrismation because they also receive confirmation as well. Now, I'm not an Eastern Rite. When I was on last time, Jordan, I made a comment about kneeling in the Eastern rites, and somebody corrected me. They said, well, in my rite, we don't kneel. Kneeling is a sign of penance. So I'm not claiming to be an expert. I'm a Latin Rite priest, and I'll do my best for all the details about the Eastern rites. As beautiful as they are, I'm not an expert. But the Eastern rites have always maintained that the connection between baptism, confirmation, and Holy Eucharist. We have that in the Latin Rite as well. And when I say Latin Rite, I just need to remind you, it's not just the traditional Latin Rite, but any Catholic that goes to what's called the Novus Ordo, if Mass is in English or Spanish or whatever, they're in the Latin Rite. That's the main rite of the church. It's just not always in Latin anymore. But in the Latin Rite, if an adult comes into the church, if somebody has never been baptized, and they go through the process of coming into the church, if they have reached the age of reason, they will receive baptism, confirmation, and Holy Eucharist in the same ceremony, oftentimes the Easter Vigil. But those three are very connected. So I think the reason in the 70s and 80s and 90s that a lot of children were told, get the same sponsor, whoever was your baptism sponsor, have that person also be your confirmation sponsor. I think they wanted to emphasize the connection between those. But, traditionally I said you were supposed to get a separate one. And that's kind of what we encourage, because if you can have two people in this world praying for you, watching over you, going in there with their little Bo Peep hook, if you start to fall off the cliff, two is better than one. And so I think there's not a problem to have two separate ones. So I don't think that your children were Christine instructed wrong. I think that was a different emphasis that was in some places, and even maybe now still. I think that either of them could be justified.